Researchers from CAMH have found brain inflammation associated with long COVID can lead to lasting neurological problems. Now, it is the first definitive proof that brain inflammation can last for months or longer, even if the person had a mild infection. And we are joined live now by Dr. Jeffrey Meyer, the senior author of the study and Canada Research Chair at CAMH. Thank you for your time, Dr. Meyer.
Thanks for inviting me.
You and I were just chatting before we came back on air, and we were talking about just the longevity of this project. And so walk me through when you and your team essentially were assembled during the pandemic to start researching on long COVID and how it really differentiates from COVID itself.
Sure. So perhaps to talk about the team, so our team pivoted towards looking at this question sort of in the late 2020s, and we applied for grant funding, and fortunately Canadian Institutes of Health Research prioritized this area as something to fund at that time. We then, after about 6 months of getting grant applications approved and regulatory approved, we went into this project, which took about a year, which is about as fast as one can do a project like this. Mm-hmm. In terms of long COVID, the reason we saw it as so important is because such a high proportion of people, like 5% of people having had COVID can have this, and very important symptoms coming on a few months after the short bout of COVID, and it can include symptoms like depression, trouble enjoying things, low energy, brain fog symptoms, mm-hmm. difficulty concentrating, thinking, remembering. And so given that there's these symptoms that can last months to over a year after having a short bout of COVID, it was important for us to look at this question.
Certainly, because as you noted too, it could have been from people who experienced, like you said, just a very mild bout of COVID, probably didn't need to be hospitalized. They may have tested positive at home with a COVID test. They isolated for a few days, and then, they went back on with their lives. But then they started noticing months later, things just weren't quite right. And you noted some of those symptoms. Can you talk to me about, now that we're starting to see more research, is there sort of a bit of validation for people who maybe have noticed there's something quite not right with me since I've had COVID, and now we're starting to at least put a name to it?
Certainly. In our study, the people that participated that had COVID and long COVID, they had only had mild to moderate bout of COVID and then had quite significant symptoms after. Some people being unable to go back to work, some people unable to get out of bed in the morning for hours at a time. Quite a severe set of symptoms, even though the initial symptoms weren't so dramatic. And this is the first evidence of inflammation in the brain using the advanced brain scanning method that we had to look for inflammation. And one of the interesting and unfortunate things is that we found that the inflammation was in areas of the brain that are important for the capacity to enjoy things, the ability to have motivation to do things and have that energy with motivation, as well as thinking speed and movement speed. And these were symptoms that were particularly important to many of our participants that corresponded to the areas and functions that we found the inflammation in the brain.
So doctor, now that you know sort of a little more about long COVID and how it's having an impact on people's brains, what are some treatments, or what can people do now that they may be able to know that, okay, this is something that I have and that I'm dealing with? How can they try to return to a sense of normalcy in their lives?
Well, I think this project points at a couple of things. One is that if there's inflammation, we might be looking at treatments and clinical trials to say, are there ways to reduce inflammation or change inflammation to make it more curative or less problematic for people? And then there also needs to be more research to understand the nature of COVID, and because sometimes inflammation comes from injury, and we may need to understand that and find ways to tell the brain to cure itself better. In the short run, while people are waiting for these kinds of more definitive answers, one might think about treatments for the symptoms that people are experiencing that are used for other illnesses. Mm-hmm. But what we'd like to do is to see more research to look at what treatments can dampen inflammation and do clinical trials to say, here's concrete evidence that this is exactly the right treatment for long COVID for these symptoms, and to characterize long COVID further so that we can even have more refined treatments to help with people with long COVID.
Doctor, we have about 25 seconds left. I do want to ask you, though, this is obviously moving the dial, in a step in the right direction when it comes to long-term research on long COVID. But how much more further do we need to go? Where are you and your team at as far as looking ahead to in years to come for, as you continue to find more information about long COVID?
We're going in two directions. One is that we actually have clinical trials that we're applying for to look at influencing inflammation in the brain and see if we can reduce some of the symptoms of long COVID. And we have some promising pilot data in this area. And the other direction that we're going is to try to understand in more detail the nature of potential injury so that we can monitor new cures to potentially reduce that injury.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Jeffrey Meyer, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and really for giving us this insight into long COVID and for people who are suffering with it. We appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for inviting me.